Hey, what is going on, everybody? Bauer Brown here. Welcome back to the channel, guys, and welcome to another video in the Blender tutorial series. Alrighty, so up to now, we've made pretty good progress, I think, right? Covered, most of, well, there's still some to go, but we covered the majority of the basic mesh editing operations. All right. And today I want to do something a little bit different, or at least in this video. I can't say today because I've been putting them out kind of fast lately. But I want to cover modifiers. All right. Now, modifiers is something that I believe can be confusing to some people, right? I know personally, when I started out, I was a bit confused. All right. I wasn't quite sure. I was a little intimidated, right? Because I didn't understand them. I didn't know exactly how they worked, how I used them, that type of thing. So we're going to be going over a few of the most common ones because you use them often. All right. And like I said, that's what this is all about. This is about the things that you're going to be using the most often. Trust me, there are parts of Blender, plenty of options in Blender that there is to learn, but we're not going to be going over them because they're either more advanced features or, something that, you're not going to be using all the time. I'm going to leave that up to you to start with the basics that I'm giving you and expand upon them at a later date. And perhaps, after we get done with like our prefab and our modeling and stuff like that, maybe I'll get back into some more advanced features. But for now, we're just going to stick with the basics. Okay. And that leaves us at modifiers. Now, modifiers are really, it's a way to make changes to your mesh non-destructively. Okay. Now you can think about it like if in GIMP or Photoshop or any image editor like that, or anything where you work in layers, right? So when you have layers in Photoshop, you start with an original image, okay? And then you create a layer, and in that layer, you can make changes to your image. Now you could turn that layer on and off to see those changes or take them away. And you can keep adding layers and adding changes, but the whole while you never interfered with your original image, right? So if you don't like any of those changes in your layers, you can delete the layers and you still have your original image. It's non-destructive. All right. And that's the same thing as modifiers. You can think about them the exact same way. All right. So I'm going to shift A and I'm going to bring a new mesh into my object here, or a new mesh into my object. I'm going to bring a new mesh into the viewport. Oh boy, we're starting already. And this time we're going to do the monkey. We are going to do Suzanne. That's right. If you look up here in the left-hand corner, they actually named the monkey Suzanne. I personally can't say it looks like a Suzanne, but to each his own. Is what it is. All right. So with Suzanne here, you can see that she looks a little bit clunky, right? Kind of really faceted, like she belongs in Minecraft. All right. So we can do better than that. We can clean her up and get her looking a bit better than what she is now. So if anybody has any guesses on how we would go about this, right? Speak up now. If not, I'm gonna spoil it for you and let you know. It is we can do that through subdivision. All right. So the way you can think about subdivision now, we know now that subdivision is breaking down your mesh into smaller parts, either more manageable parts or you're breaking it down for another reason. All right. So think about it like if you add more parts to it, kind of like if you take a photo or some kind of image, and if you add more pixels to it, right, you're adding more detail. You're making it capable of more detail. It's the same thing in our farm sim maps. When we work with textures or we work just the map itself, maybe it's an info layer. If we increase the resolution, right, we increase the detail. It's the same thing here, right? Or not the more symmetry, the more geometry we add to the mesh and break it down into smaller pieces, the more detail it's capable of. All right. So that's how we use subdivision. Now, what I taught you guys up until this point to subdivide, now I would select the entire model. I'd right click S for subdivide. Okay. Now you can see it's already starting to look a little more subdivided. Now I can increase the number of cuts and I can move that pretty far up there, right? All the way up to 10 is pretty extensive, right? My smoothness I already have turned up a bit, but I'll turn that up just a little bit more. Okay, now let's have a look at Suzanne. I'm going to have to go into object mode because you can see the sheer number of vertices I have going on is just incredible. All right, but going in the object mode, she's looking pretty good, right? Compared to how she was, much, much better, right? And that's by adding the additional geometry. Now I could take that a step further and I could shade smooth, and now she's looking really good, right? So Suzanne's got it going on right now. She is looking good. But the only problem now, and maybe not the only problem, but a big glaring problem is the sheer amount of geometry of going on. Now, if I was the artist of this said monkey and I wanted to make some changes here, I have some problems, right? Maybe not problems, but it's going to take me a while. Because, like, let's say I wanted to do a little bit of work on this eyebrow here, right? So I'd have to go through and select, all of these vertices, and I got my work cut out for me here to get all of this done, right? So you get all this selected. So depending on the changes you want to make, so maybe I want to raise this eyebrow a little bit, or whatever I want to do with it. Um, like I said, it's a lot of work, and that's just for this change. If I had a lot of changes to make, yeah, that's probably not really the best workflow, right? To have this much geometry going on in a model that you are currently editing. All right. It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Let me back out of here. Let me get out of the back to my original monkey, to the OG monkey. All right. So what we can do instead is use a modifier, right? Like a layer. We can add a layer to this. Now, on the right hand side of my screen, you can see this wrench here. If I hover over the wrench, you have modifiers. Now, if you're on an older version of Blender, right, when you go up to add modifier, it probably instantly comes up with a big menu and you can pick through all sorts of things. Uh, Blender 4.0 is a little bit different, where you need to drill down through the list, basically. Now, we're going to be sticking mostly with this generate list, but we will get into others perhaps as time goes on. But from here, I'm going to go down and I'm going to pick the subdivision surface. Okay. Now you can see underneath what's going on. You can see that there looks like there's some changes already going on here, right? Everything looks a little splotchy, a little white. Now, the first listing I have here, the first setting is called levels viewport. And that's basically just the amount of subdivision that you want. Okay. And if I turn that up to 3, oops, I didn't turn it. Let me do that again. Turn it up to 3. Now you can see that things are looking significantly better underneath there, right? And it had even applied to smoothing. Now, speaking of the smoothing, that's the difference between this Catmull Clark and the simple. The Catmull Clark will subdivide and smooth at the same time, right? It's the same thing that I did when I subdivided manually, and then I added a bit of smoothing. And that's kind of what Catmull Clark is doing here. If you keep it on simple, you can see there's no smoothing. It's just subdivided. If I go in, really close, you can see that everything is subdivided. It's just not smooth at all. All right. So keep it on Catmull Clark for now because it just looks better. Now there's a few more options that we can choose from up here, right? And the first one here is edit mode, and that's whether or not we want to be able to see that subdivision while we're editing. If we turn that off in edit mode, we no longer see basically our modifier, right? If you want to have a look at it, you would flip on over to object mode, and there you go. We got Suzanne in all of her glory, looking pretty good. I can go back into edit mode. We can turn that back on so we can see what we're doing. And the good thing about this now, with this modifier applied, right, and using a modifier instead of subdividing the way that I had going on originally, is if I want to make any changes to Suzanne now, it's much, much easier. Okay. Right. So I just, I pick the areas that I need to work on. Right. And I don't have 1,000 different a thousand different vertices that I need to select here. I only have these couple, so I can make the changes that I need to make, and then I'm off and running. Right, so it's much more manageable than it was initially. Right, and it's we're way better off with less geometry to work with as far as making our edits go. All right, over here on the second selection, we have a real time display. All right, and that's whether or not as we make our changes and we view the modifier if it's done in real time, which obviously we want to do. And then the last one we're not really going to worry about. That's if we want the modifier to show up during our renders, and that's the second setting down here, also with render. We're not going to worry about renders right now. Perhaps in the future we'll get into them, but for what we are going to do, we're not going to need renders at all. All right. So, like I said, don't be intimidated by modifiers. It's non-destructive until you apply it. Okay, because at some point when you're happy with your end result, you do need to apply it, right? So if we like what we have going on with Suzanne here, and we say, okay, that looks good, we're going to make that permanent. We need to apply it. Okay, and I'll show you how to do that here in just 1 second. Think there's anything else I need to say about that. I think I said it's very simple, right? Just think about it like layers. If you want to make some changes or you want to test some things out, see how they go. Okay, you're more than welcome to do that. If for some reason you decide that you don't want this modifier, like, don't really like the subdivision, okay, off you go. You're right back to the same monkey that you started with, right? So you didn't lose anything. Everything's good. Or you can go back and you can subdivide surface just like we had. So it's up to you whether or not you want to make that change. All right. So there's going to be plenty of scenarios where you want to subdivide, right? And instead of adding that extra geometry that you now have to work with, we can keep it split up and we can do it non-destructively until we're ready to make that change. All right. So trust me when I say this is going to come in handy more times than you know. Now, one word of advice is to keep this levels of viewport, right? The amount of subdivision, keep that to a minimum, right? That's the whole name of the game with Blender. Keep it as low as you can go and have it still look good. All right. So not only is it adding extra geometry to your model, right? So if I commit the changes and look at my triangles up here, I'm sure it's going to be an astronomical number. It's going to be ridiculously high. Right now, it's only counting my base mesh, right? My simple mesh, not my edited mesh. But it also has diminishing returns, which means on the very lower levels, right, when you get up to like between 1 and 2, pretty decent amount of change. 2 and 3, definitely more change. But as you get higher into 4, you can see more change, but it's not as much. Uh, Up in the 5, it's barely even noticeable. And the higher you go, it's kind of the same thing. It gets less and less noticeable while adding significantly more geometry to your mesh. So that's what I mean by diminishing returns. So keep it low as you can, and have it still look good, right? So even in my opinion, even 2 is not so bad for a game, right? There's a lot that you can do with textures to cover this stuff up, and you'll never ever know. All right, so you spent your time working on Suzanne the monkey, and everything looks good, and you decide, hey, I'm going to go with it. How do we work past that? All right. So up here next to these selections that you just had, there's going to be a drag down box, right? And in that box, you can see at the very top, it says apply. Now, next to that, the shortcut code for it. So you can either apply or you can hit Control A over top of your 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 viewport or your modifier here when you have it selected. All right. But you cannot do this in edit mode. Not sure why, but you can. And we are in edit mode right now. So once you click over to object mode, now you can see it's not grayed out anymore. So you can either apply that way or you can Control A and that just applied all of your changes. So if we were to go back to edit mode, you can see that we have all that extra geometry now to work with. This is why it's going to be one of the last things that you do, is to apply your modifiers. So keep in mind that if you had not applied your modifiers, right, if I was still in the unapplied state like I am right here, I couldn't actually export this out to the game world, right? These modifiers would still, they wouldn't be applied. It would look just like your base model. All right. So you do have to at some point apply your modifier before you export. Now, there's a reason, like it says with render and stuff like that. So you can get away with it there, where you can render your scene without applying the modifier, which is kind of nice for those guys just making, doing like I said, they're doing commercials or advertisements or creating some type of scene. That works pretty good. But we have a practical use outside of Blender for this object, so you're definitely going to have to apply those modifiers. All right, so does that make sense or no? Hopefully, yes. Right. So modifiers are nothing more than just a temporary change until you decide to commit them, and they do all sorts of different things. Right. So this is a lot more helpful and time saving than it would be to manually subdivide our entire monkey. We can just make a few small changes over on the modifier and we're good to go, right? Easy enough. Okay. Second modifier I want to get into is called the mirror modifier. All right. Now, the mirror modifier is going to be a way, it does exactly what it sounds like. It mirrors something. It's to make work on something that's symmetrical. All right. So you can see Suzanne here is symmetrical, right? Right down the middle. If you look at her from the front, right down the middle, she's the same from either side. Right. So I can probably ensure you that the artist that created this did not work on each side individually. They only worked on one side. Now, if we were going to use the mirror modifier ourselves, there's kind of two ways to do this. There's an older way and a newer way. The older way, we would be in wireframe mode, okay, and we would select half of this mesh, okay, and I am still in object mode, so that didn't work out too good. Let's try that again. We would select half the mesh, and we from there we would just delete it, right? So we would just delete the other half of that mesh, like so. Okay, so now we're stuck with half a monkey. All right, going back over to our modifiers, we'll go back to add modifier, generate, and then we're going to go to mirror modifier. And instantly you can see the other half of Suzanne appeared. Okay, which is kind of nice. So now when we work on Suzanne and we want to make some changes, like if I want to make some changes maybe to this earlobe over here, right? Just grab a few of these parts here, like so, maybe a couple of these. There you go. Okay, so when I make some changes to her now, it will reflect on both sides. Okay. So I don't have to make changes to one side and then come over and do the other side and hope that looks okay and so on and so forth. Now, the way that this works with the mirror modifier, all right, because I know new things can be confusing. It's mirroring yeah, across the x axis. Okay. So this way from left to right. Actually, Blender tends to anything on the right side is your original mesh, and the mirrored part would be on the left. That's the way it tends to do it. Okay. But it's when it says x axis, it's not talking about the axis that you're splitting on, it's the axis that you are mirroring across. All right. And right now we're mirroring across the x axis. Now, the same would apply if we did the y axis. Okay. Um, I don't have it set up that Y would be actually maybe I probably did if I spin it. Let me turn this off and turn this on. I did. Okay. So the Y axis is that way. It's going along the Y axis. And then the same thing for the Z axis, right? So it's mirroring along the Z axis. And if you wanted to, you can have all three of these on, and there is, a use case for that. Trust me, and I'm gonna show you that in just a few. We have a use for that. Now, I did mention that there is an old way and a new way of using this mirror modifier. Okay. So I'm back to is it the original Suzanne? I'm not sure. Yes, I'm back to the original Suzanne. Okay. Now, like I said, the old way, and it's the way that I learned, would be to split this in half into two pieces, and I'd only have, one half of this that I would work from. All right. If we go back and we add that mirror modifier again, all right, where is it? It's not in there. I'll have to find it the long way. Okay, we go down to the mirror modifier. And down here, we have what's called bisect. and bisect is going to split that for us. Okay. So you can see now that if I didn't delete that mesh, look, if you look up here around our eyebrows, like up in this area, it's duplicating basically both sides of that for us because we didn't delete half of that, right? But if we go into bisect, okay, you can see how that got a lot better instantly. And that's because that's basically what it's doing is it's bisecting it for us, but we still need to flip it. So we're going to flip on the x-axis also, and you can see that we're looking much better. So that's what this bisect and flip does. It acts like it does the same thing that we did by cutting it in half, and then it's going to mirror one side to the other. So now, if I was, to make changes here to Suzanne, like somewhere up in this area, all right, let me get back into that mode there. Let me try that. Okay, so if I was to make my changes, well, they're not reflected. So what did I do here? I didn't do something right. Is it flip? Not flip. Oh, yeah. Okay, maybe it is flip. I know flip, I normally, got to think about that. How did I use flip last time? I guess flip depends on, not sure. Sorry, I confused myself on that one. I'm positive that it has something to do with that though. The modifier as far as being able to cut it in half. The flip. See here. Maybe it's just flipping it so it's only on this side. Oh, okay, I get it. Okay. So let's back up here a minute. Get that. Oops. Get that change. I'm gonna go over to the other side of Suzanne. Right. And I'm gonna make my changes on this side. Okay. Like I said, remember when I said previously that with Blender, your original is on the right side and you can see your changes on the left side. I'm guessing that with Flip, it would be, there you go. It would be the changes, your original would now, because you flipped it, right? So your original would be on the left side, your changes would be on the right. Sorry about that. Didn't mean to confuse myself and everybody else. I knew there was something to it. But that's what the bisect does. Okay. So it basically cuts it down the middle for you. And then flip is if you don't want to be on the right hand side. If you want to work on the left hand side instead, if you have a preference from one to the other. All right. That's what flip does. So it's not exactly necessary. Okay. And then, like I said, you can work on all axes if you want to. And then, of course, these other selections that you have up top here, it's the same as we had with the subdivision modifier, whether or not you want to see those changes, in your viewport, rendered in real time, blah, blah, blah. You get it. All right. Now, the way this works, okay, now I'm going to go back to my old style of working with Suzanne here. Okay. So I'm going to get rid of that just temporarily. I'm going to go into wire mode and I'm going to delete half of her. All right. I don't know why. I'm more comfortable this way. The bisect works okay, but I have something I want to show you, and I need to do it this way. Okay. Um, let's see here. We'll go back into modifier, and I'm going to add the mirror modifier again. Okay. And then mirror it on the x axis. Now, if I select my geometry here, okay, now let's say I want to move this for whatever reason. I need to move this over a little bit. Okay, let me see what happened there. What did I do? There we go. So you can see what's happening. I should have selected her in wireframe mode. It's always a problem if you don't do that. I have a bad habit of doing that as well, where I'm not selecting her in wireframe. Actually, I want to select the whole thing here. Okay, so now if I move that on the x-axis, you can see that I have this big gaping hole in the middle. All right, and that's not really something that you would want. Maybe you're doing some kind of character creation or something like that, and her face is looking a little too narrow, right? And you want to widen that up. That's where this clipping comes in. If you see this clipping here, and if you hover over top of that, you can see that it says to prevent vertices from going through the mirror during transform. So now if I want to move one section here, okay, you can see what's happening. It stretches that middle part. So if it's just a little bit, you want to widen it, you can probably get away with it and have it still look pretty good, right? So it's not throwing that big, huge gap in there because the gap ends up being in place because it's mirroring the gap. When you moved it, you created a tiny gap, on one side, and it's mirroring that gap on the other side. That's why we got that big old gap. Okay. Now there are other like I said, there's other options that you can choose with mirroring, and we're not going to be getting into that. We're just going to cover, like I said, the very basics. I mean, that's something that perhaps we can come back to. All right, now there's a lot of use cases. Like, let me see if I can give you an example. Let's add a cube in here. Okay, go into edit mode. How do I want to do this? Actually, let's try some loop cuts. Let's put some loop cuts in here. Okay. There we go. We got some loop cuts. Do I want to put one this way? Sure. I'll put one on every axis. There we go. Why not? All right. So from here, if I only want to work on, if I know that my changes are going to be like front to back, as well as side to side, okay, I can delete basically a quarter or three quarters of that mesh, right? So starting back at the front, if I keep my mirror modifier on, let's go back to modifier. Let's go generate mirror modifier. Okay, so now I'm just on the x axis. Okay, so it's only mirroring that way, but I want to go along the y axis also. So there you go. So now I got a complete cube again, right? And any changes that I make to this one small piece is going to reflect in the rest of them. So if I subdivide that, you can see the rest got subdivided. Now my smoothness is still on 1. So put that back to 0. You always have to watch that. Okay, so I want to select just that single face. We're going to pull that down. Okay, so you can see how much time this is saving you already. Maybe, I don't know, maybe you wanted to make a chair or something. I'm not sure. But either way, you can do it. So delete faces. So now we're back down to a smaller object. But you get the idea of what's going on here, right? So, front to back, side to side, you're mirroring this entire object. Now, it's worth noting, not worth noting, it's definitely worth noting that this mirror is not so much happening on the Z axis, which it is, but it's dependent on the position of this origin. Okay. And that origin just happens to be dead center on that Z axis. All right. So if you were to move that origin one way or the other, things wouldn't be looking so good. Okay. So you couldn't necessarily take this object, right? So you couldn't select the entire object. Well, the origin is attached to it. But if I was to select the entire object, move that along the man, I guess this isn't going to work. Well, it would actually, because of where the origin is, I'm moving it away from the origin. All right, so let me try something here really quick. I'm not sure this is going to work, so just bear with me. If I move that over, mm, canceled it. Move that over here. All right, and what I'm going to do is I am going to go back into object mode, and I'm going to set origin to geometry. Yeah, that didn't work too good. Interesting, but it didn't work too good. All right. From there, I guess I would probably, I don't know what I would have to do there. I would have to move that again to get it to line up. Yeah, I'd have to move it again. Okay, but you can see what I mean, how it works on the origin. So now, I mean, I'm back in business, kinda. I still have some movements I need to make. I'd have to move it along the y-axis also. And I'm really getting off on a tangent here. I shouldn't be, but I am. Okay, so now you would be back in business because it's like I said, it's working off of this origin. So any change that I make to it now would reflect back into my model, right? So if I was to maybe subdivide that part, which it didn't because this is broken up, it's not a complete. Remember what I said how subdivision works, or did I mention that? I know I mentioned it with some things that if it's interrupted in some way, shape, or form. Like if I go into vertices, right, you can see that I have all these extra vertices. So this isn't a perfect quad anymore, right? None of these are. These are all broken up. It's not just a nice, even, nice four sides. It's broken up because it has these extra vertices. All right. And in that case, I can't subdivide, at least with visible results. Like if I hit S for subdivide, you can see I have all the extra vertices, but you can't physically see the extra faces that showed up. So it's not necessarily the faces that are subdividing. It's just, I guess, the edges, right? So it's not really helping me out too much in that respect. But either way, the point that I was trying to make there is any changes that I make, it'll still reflect in the model, right? Even though I moved it because it's using this origin here as, the center point for those changes. It's very important to keep in mind. That's why most times when you're modeling, it's much easier to just leave everything where it is, right there at the world origin, and kind of work from there, or at least in my opinion, right? It just makes a lot more sense. All right, so the mirror modifier, it's something like I said, it's going to come in extremely handy. Depending on what you're working on, you're definitely going to find a use for it. Now, I'll admit in the beginning, I didn't always find a use for it. I did things the hard way for quite a while just because I didn't know any better. I knew the mirror modifier was there, I knew what it did, but I didn't know how to get started with it. So, like I said, for example, this table, if you wanted to use the mirror modifier in this table, this is where your loop cut would come in handy, right? So you would just put that right smack dab in the middle, get yourself into front orthographic mode, wireframe. Let's see, I'd have to get in a face select, so I make sure I delete all the faces. All right, and I'm hitting delete and V for vertices. I don't know why that V doesn't show up. Oops, I did the wrong thing there, didn't I? Yes, I did. I'm hitting delete and F for faces. Oh, yeah, I'm losing it. But I don't know why that second key, once I hit delete, that second key doesn't show up on my thing here. Okay, so back into add modifier, generate mirror modifier. It's already set up on the x-axis for you. So that's how to get started, at least with a cube. And then any changes you want to make, from there, we can subdivide. Okay, add a couple subdivisions, and then from here you can do anything you want, and that's going to show up on the other side of your model. Okay. Trust me when I say, use guys, once you get used to it, it cuts down your modeling time significantly, very significantly. So if any model that you're going to work on, is going to be symmetrical, maybe it's a chair or it's a table of some sort, anything, even an automobile. Like if you're doing, some houses are that way, they're symmetrical from one side to the other. An automobile, the body of it anyhow is symmetrical from one side to the other. And that's the thing, not your entire model doesn't need to be symmetrical. You can make changes. Do the parts that need to be symmetrical, right? Maybe just the body of the vehicle, the seats, the wheels are all symmetrical. So you get all that out of the way. And then once you commit those changes, you can come back and you can add the steering wheel and everything else. But not only that, but the steering wheel may be a separate object. You add that as a separate object, and that extra object doesn't have the modifier applied, so you can add that in there, and it doesn't get mirrored. Trust me, just going to want to play around with it. The more you play around with it, the more you're going to figure things out. It's going to make sense, and you know that you're good to go. Right. So, like I said, it's a very handy feature to have. And in the end, it's all non-destructive, right? So anything that I did here, I can decide, yeah, I don't like it, and I'll just start all over. And now you are stuck with the changes you made, to your original mesh. With the modifier, that's a bit different, with the mirror modifier, because you already cut the mesh in half and made changes to it, and so on and so forth. Right. And the same thing, I guess, goes for Suzanne. If you decide that you don't want that subdivision modifier, your original changes or your changes to the original mesh are still going to stick, right? It's only the modifier half that you can get rid of. All right, so that's what modifiers are. Like I said, the easiest way to think about them is just think about it like a layer in Photoshop or GIMP, something non-destructive, right? You can make changes. If you don't like it, you get rid of it. No harm, no foul. You're good to go. But they come in really, really handy. So there's two modifiers that we got out of the way: subdivision and mirror modifier. Hopefully, either one of those made a little bit of sense to you, because it's likely we are going to be using them sometime down the road. So commit them to memory. Okay. And that's it. I'm at 35 minutes. I'm going to wrap it up right there. Yeah, that's it. So with that being said, I'm Bauer Brown. See you on the next one.